You're not free. You're not even close to free.
In the last episode, I told you about the zoo in your head and your layered brain. And you learnt about shamans and schizophrenics, and found out how they're the same thing. Now it's time to learn how shamanism was eclipsed. It's time to learn about the civilization trap. I'm here at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, near the town of Sanliurfa on the Syrian border. Behind me is one of the most incredible finds in archaeology of all time. Archaeologists still don't know quite how to interpret it, but one thing is for certain: everything you learnt in school about the origins of civilization is bunk. According to the conventional story, civilization is supposed to have emerged suddenly about 5,000 years ago in Sumer in Egypt, and it emerges spontaneously, with a big bang. Suddenly there's agriculture, there are forms of government, there's state and religion, and there are no precursors. It happens as if by magic. There seems to be something wrong with this story, and amateurs have been saying so for a long time. Anthony Boval and Graham Hancock, for instance, have long been saying that there must have been a much more ancient precursor civilization, Atlantis. But they were dismissed and laughed out of court by the mainstream archaeologists. They said, stop speculating. If there was such a civilization, then show us the pottery shards. Well, at about the turn of the century, they got a lot more than they bargained for. They got their comeuppance here at Göbekli Tepe, but there were no pottery shards. It turned out that this site is almost definitely a temple, and it's 11,600 years old, far, far older than the invention of pottery. What emerged at Göbekli Tepe was so shocking it defies superlatives, and almost 20 years later archaeologists have still not quite digested the discovery, and so important as it is, it still hasn't fully entered mainstream public awareness yet, even now. This amazing construction with 200 standing T-shaped limestone monoliths, some of which are 7 meters tall and weigh over 10 tons, are arranged in about 20 circles, and they include stunning carvings and stone reliefs. It was built by pre-pottery Neolithic people at a time when your ancestors were supposed to be primitive nomadic hunter-gatherers, thousands of years before they were supposed to have carved their first stone block, and long, long before metal tools were invented. Stone cutting and relief carvings like this were only supposed to emerge 6,000 years later. To put Göbekli Tepe's astounding antiquity of 11,600 years into perspective, consider that the pyramids of Giza are commonly believed to be only about 4,500 years old, and Stonehenge is dated at around 5,000 years old. So that makes Göbekli Tepe the Stonehenge of the people that built Stonehenge, plus a couple of thousand years on top for good measure. The archaeological site was discovered on the land of this Kurdish shepherd, and today his grandson Mehmet Tarık runs the gift shop.
This is Göbekli Tepe. All this is my family's area. My grandfather 34 years ago found statue. And
while ploughing a field on his farm, his grandfather unearthed this 40-centimeter statuette and dutifully reported it to the government. Today the artifact is closeted away, somewhere deep inside the Sanliurfa Museum. The Turkish authorities regard it as too lewd to put on public display. The shepherd was never rewarded for his discovery. The only thanks he got was to have his land confiscated to make way for a UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with car park and visitor centre. Up until his death in 2014, the late Klaus Schmidt, a pot-bellied German archaeologist, oversaw the excavation of the site.
Göbekli Tepe means mound with belly, or mound with belly.
Professor Klaus Schmidt started excavating this site around about 1994 in an amazing stroke of synchronicity. It was also about the time that the Chauvet caves were being discovered in France. What emerged seemed to be baffling. Although it appeared to be a human settlement here at first, it turned out that nobody actually lived here. It was undoubtedly a temple complex with astronomical alignments. But it wasn't a place where humans settled and lived. It wasn't a village. Yet amazingly, they were brewing beer and malt here. The amazing thing is that that was many thousands of years before agriculture was invented, before the domestication of maize and wheat. Not only was beer being drunk here, but vast quantities of animals were being consumed on site and their remains were found. These stone sentinels behind me are figurines of people. They represent headless people. Whoever built Göbekli Tepe must have expended an extraordinary amount of time and effort building it, especially if they were hunter-gatherers. The story gets much stranger still. Göbekli Tepe was in use for about 1,000 years, and then an amazing thing happened. They covered it over, filled it with till deliberately. Now why would they do that? It's almost as if they got Notre Dame or St. Paul's Cathedral and just filled it with rubble. What was going on? And it wasn't buried just once. It was rebuilt again on a more modest scale on top of the old site some years later. That site was also deliberately filled in, and then it was rebuilt a third and final time, though the last incarnation was far less impressive than the previous two. It was buried for the last time around 8000 BCE. As many have correctly speculated, the key to understanding the entire temple complex at Göbekli Tepe is here in enclosure D, and in particular Pillar 43, this stone here. Pillar 43 has now colloquially become known as the vulture stone.
Very often we have combinations of motifs depicted. They are very rich world, showing a narrative character, showing that we have illustrations of stories, of mythological stories in front of us. And even more, when we look to this part, we have objects of unknown function, but we have animals, a bird, a quadruped, and a reptile, a frog. And such an association together with the objects, it's very similar to what things we know from, for example, Old Egypt, from 4th millennium Egypt on slate palettes. So started the Egyptian hieroglyphic writing in the same way, the sign of city and animals added to it.
One far-fetched theory says that Göbekli Tepe is actually a time capsule, preserving information about a comet that devastated Earth after the Younger Dryas. The theory goes that this is a warning to future generations, basically to you. The story is far-fetched for a number of reasons. For starters, how did they know that the comet would come back again, and when? How did they know that you would dig up their message in a bottle? And what were you supposed to do about the information that a comet was coming to destroy your Earth? And then why would they bother to recreate the time capsule 3 times, all layered one over the other? This rather wacky comet theory actually comes from a misinterpretation of Pillar 43. The circle here is misread to depict the head of a comet, and this thatching pattern here is interpreted as the comet's tail. In truth, what the circle represents is what archaeologists used to call a soul hole or seelenloch. Seelenlochs are bolt holes or escape holes for your spirit or soul to escape this realm after death. Shamans intended soul holes to be a kind of birth canal, from the womb of this life into the afterlife outside the celestial dome. Soul holes are visible in many places around Göbekli Tepe. And this is plainly a gateway to the stars. And the specific star is Deneb. Some people have speculated that the alignments here at Göbekli Tepe were with Sirius, the dog star. But that's not actually correct. Göbekli Tepe's alignment is not to the south towards Sirius. It's aligned to the north, to the star Deneb. in the constellation Cygnus, the swan. In ancient times, Cygnus was known as the vulture rather than the swan, and Deneb was a special star indeed. It was the pole star. Now you may be wondering, isn't Polaris the pole star? Well, in those times, Deneb was the pole star. Over time, the pole star changes. It's Polaris now, but 11,600 years ago, Deneb was the pole star. It's all due to precession of the Earth. Precession of the Earth is a slight wobble that the Earth has, which means that the pole changes over time. So this is Deneb, the pole star and ultimate soul hole for escape through the celestial dome and up to heaven after death. And you are supposedly carried up there on the back of a stork or vulture.
Look out for Mr. Stork, that persevering chap. He'll come along and drop a bundle in your lap.
The stork doesn't bring the babies. The stork is a psychopomp or soul guide that delivers your soul after rebirth and ascension up into the afterlife. Look, here you are, personally represented as Orion, the headless hunter. The giveaway is not only because the figure is headless, but also because he has an erect penis. You were probably told by a pimply counselor as a kid in summer camp that this is Orion's scabbard or sword, but it's actually his penis. That's Orion's signature identifier, along with a bird's head or no head, i.e. he's alien cortex free. Here's your alter ego again in the Lascaux cave in France this time, along with erect penis and Deneb as the pole star.
We have the transformation into what we call in German Bildzeichen, and from these Bildzeichen other signs are developing, and here we're coming to our letter Alpha.
And as for this, it's exactly what it looks like, a basket. The thatching pattern is not a comet's tail, but rather a skewmorph of basket weave. Just like the pattern on these pottery jars, which hark back to the weave in the baskets that they superseded. I'll go into why there's supposed to be a basket in the night sky in a later episode, when we go into more depth about the religion of the people at Göbekli Tepe. And I'll also tell you what these 3 mysterious handbags are all about and what's in them. But here's a hint. It's closely related to the much older shamanic mythology at the Shovi cave. Göbekli Tepe was actually built under the guidance of shamans. Not authentic shamans, mind you, but pseudo-shamans, kinds of tricksters, carnival fortune tellers and guru clowns. Charlatans started to eclipse the genuine schizophrenic shamans. These frauds were starting to sell a new religion to the people, complete with stories and formulas for escape to an afterlife and ascension up into a heaven that doesn't actually exist. Let's call them religious priests and priestesses rather than shamans, because they're still around even today selling much the same old fiction, for much the same old reasons. They acted as false mirrors that pandered to your ancestors' dangerous new thirst for immortality. They faked genuine religious eupsychosis using entheogens and psychotropic drugs. I'll also explain the specifics of the trick in a later episode. For now, all that's important is that the discovery of Göbekli Tepe overturned the apple cart and blew the conventional origin story of human civilization right out the water. According to the alien cortex's old self-serving origin story, in the beginning, in the before times before your alien cortex supposedly came down from heaven and saved you all, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Then luckily, on hallowed ground in a so-called fertile crescent, somewhere in the plains below Gobekli Tepe, in a golden triangle no less, about 6,000 years ago, no doubt eagerly anticipating the benefits of industrialization and the Enlightenment, hunter-gatherers at long last finally smartened up, settled down in villages, and started farming. Farming led to a surplus that then freed up a lucky few of you to start stargazing, inventing science, technology, mathematics, and writing. With the benefit of all those blessings, the villagers prospered and soon evolved into cities, and from those urban centers emerged the city-state, governments, and financial and legal systems. Admittedly, some unfortunate baggage accompanied all of this, like state religion, racist nationalism, suppression of women, slavery, social inequality, and a never-ending parade of tyrants and wars, but all of those will supposedly soon be abolished. Just as soon as you get more civilized. Watch this space, but don't hold your breath. But alien cortex be praised, at least you're all now civilized. And you have no reason to look back other than if you want to polish your credentials as an archaeologist or prehistorian, or fawn over the alien cortex, or both. The problem is that this conventional story is riddled with holes, and never made a whole lot of sense to begin with. But until the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, almost no one, except on the lunatic fringe, was prepared to say that the alien cortex had no clothes. The idea of a fertile crescent so bursting with fecundity it just begs to be farmed has been so oversold, it's very easy to forget that until you build a canal through it, it isn't fertile at all. And once you build a canal, it's really subject to salt leaching. It's true that the floodplains around the Tigris, the Euphrates and the Nile are fertile, but they aren't any more fertile than any other floodplain, for example the Danube or the Volga. The myth of fertility in the so-called Fertile Crescent Dust Bowl has been pushed so hard in order to support the rather dubious agricultural surplus theory of the origins of civilization that came mainly from Gordon Childs' idea of a so-called urban revolution. That idea has been peddled since the 1930s, and sadly it's still taught in academia today. It's not at all clear why any hunter-gatherer would want to get a sedentary lifestyle, settle down and start farming. If you did that, the first thing you'd notice is that your leisure time would disappear. Hunter-gatherers spent about 2 hours a week working. Now compare that to your 40, maybe 60 or 80-hour work week that you have. One of the things you'd have to give up as a hunter-gatherer turned farmer is the luxury of wearing hides and skins. You would have to resort to wearing woven clothing, and the time and labor involved in making your clothes would be extreme. After your leisure time, the next thing to disappear is your health. The sedentary life and agriculture is very unhealthy compared to a hunter-gatherer. Domesticated animals are a pale shadow of their wild cousins. They're scrawnier, smaller, and the same is true with domesticated humans. Your wild ancestors were not only smarter, they were more robust, taller, and healthier than you are.
Once you crowd people into a small area, you have domesticated animals, and you have the fleas and ticks and rats and mice that feed on the grain, and all of our zoonotic diseases are diseases that move between domesticated animals and human beings. So the early valley states, with this concentration of people, domesticated animals, and grain, were also unhealthy. If we find skeletons of the same period of time in which one group is hunter-gatherers and the other are living inside grain states, the hunter and gatherers' skeletons are larger, they're taller, and their bones show less evidence of disease. Whereas the people living in states, their skeletal remains are smaller, and their bones show a lot more evidence of disease. So we have a lot of evidence that it was not healthy to live in early states, not to mention the question of taxes and conscription.
It's not something that's often talked about in polite alien cortex society, but your brain is shrinking. You're actually dumbing down. Over the last 20,000 years, you've lost about this much neural matter in your brain, about the size of a cat's brain or a tennis ball's worth of neural matter. That's due to domestication. The conventional story of the origin of civilization relies heavily on that agricultural surplus. But was there a surplus? What evidence is there for it? Well, actually, none at all. In fact, the evidence is to the contrary. Right up until today, farming has always been very marginal activity. Until government subsidized farming, there really was no surplus. It's all a myth. Even today, farmers rely on agricultural subsidies, tax breaks and irrigation schemes, things like that, to subsidize farming. Otherwise, it's a complete bust. So the idea of the city-state arising out of farming activity is completely upside down. It makes no sense. Farming arrives because of the city-state. Farming didn't arise spontaneously, generating a surplus that created civilization. It was actually the other way around. Places like Göbekli Tepe created the need that gave rise to agriculture. But now that your scholars are starting to correct their mistake about the agricultural surplus theory, they're now off on another wrong tangent. The new religion-first theory of civilization that is now gaining momentum in the wake of Göbekli Tepe's discovery. Göbekli Tepe is indeed a temple or sacred site, and it's true it was built for religious reasons. But it would be extremely naive to assume that means religion came first. So if it wasn't agriculture first, and civilization didn't stem from religion, where did civilization actually come from? Why did it come about? And why did it start where it did? The answer is that it all started with trade, not religion. It was commerce that preceded everything. First came trade, and then came organized religion. Ideas about the afterlife were just one of the things that were traded down at the market square. And the people doing a lot of that trading were the shamans. At least when it came to trade in ideas about life after death and other highly saleable commodities, like protective spells, faith healing, and exclusive tickets to a mythical afterlife. These days, you probably have a very distorted impression of how a temple, church, mosque, or other religious place is actually supposed to be. Since the alien cortex takes itself so seriously, temples and churches are generally solemn, stuffy places today. But roll back the centuries of whitewash or brainwash, and you will find that they were far more fun. Back in the glorious days when people were still free, they started out more like rock concerts or mind-blowingly wild cult festivals or carnivals. Think more Burning Man Festival rather than the Sistine Chapel. You'll notice that both demand just as much religious devotion and sacrifice from their devotees. Burning Man may be more so.
How was Burning Man?
How was Burning Man?
Let me say this. The burn was everything I needed it to be. Everything I wanted it to be. Plus, none of that. It was spiritual, physical, mental. It was everything. It was literally everything. In the beginning, there was the playa, an arid plain where no seed, man, or beast can find purchase. And forth from this land that God has forsaken, a city arises overnight, with streets and public works and a 5-star hotel, but no money.
Oh, it's like a barter system.
Bartering? Do you see me walking around with a duffel bag full of beaver pelts and spices from the Orient? The burn runs on a gifting economy.
Well, maybe the burn does, but at Gobekli Tepe, they had money. All over Gobekli Tepe, you can find these axe heads. What these were was money. These were a token of exchange, much more than just a simple axe head. Flint and obsidian projectile points were found in huge numbers at Gobekli Tepe. They not only represent money, but also an inflated currency. There are far, far too many stone tools here to be useful to hunt game. And in addition, the wild game and natural resources in general soon began to run out in the wilderness surrounding Gobekli Tepe as the wild party and the massive concentration of people started to deplete the local environment. So they resorted to farming in a desperate attempt to fill the shortfall. And that only made things worse. According to Wiki Galactica, the irrefutable source of all truth and its negation, in the case of Göbekli Tepe, the genuine shamans eventually stepped in and stopped the party. After the destruction of their social fabric and the surrounding natural environment, it was easy to convince the people to bury the whole complex, to mend their wicked ways, to turn away from overconsumption, religion, sin and debt, and to return to their hunter-gatherer Eden. The fake shamans or religious priests were rounded up and put to death, along with the marketplace and party organizers. Aside from driving away game and denuding the local environment, the priests were accused of making ancestral spirits withdraw their protection, driving people towards madness. The best way to interpret that is that the alien cortex cut people off from their old archaic ancestral brain and made them inhuman. But even as Gobekli Tepe was being buried, it was already too late. Your alien cortex was already out of Pandora's box and running, deeply embedded in your genome. Some hardcore civilization addicts recreated the freak show, and the whole process repeated itself once again, though not on quite such a grand scale as before, because the natural resources had been so depleted. That party burnt itself out too, and was brought to heel and buried all over again. It happened once again a third and final time, but by then the party was over for good at Göbekli Tepe. But not for mankind. Once Eden was destroyed, the party instinct spilled over and spread to Sumer, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. It was just like Burning Man.
So how did all this begin?
Well, it began spontaneously, as a playful impulse. It was the summer solstice, late June in 1985, the longest day of the year.
Each time civilization reached its consumption emission limit and burnt out, it simply relocated to the next fertile region, moving like a bushfire and leaving behind scorched earth wherever it went. Today, Göbekli Tepe is your entire earth. You are all starting to feel the heat. Round about now, you should be asking where all the shamans are, because it's time to end the party and bury the place once again. The crucial epiphany is to realize that back then there was no difference between a religious temple, a treasury, a hospital, a marketplace, a brothel, and a wild open-air seasonal festival. Göbekli Tepe was all of those. The only thing it wasn't was a village or human settlement. That came later when the annual party ran on so long that by the time the next summer solstice festival came around, hangers-on from last year's party hadn't left yet. At that point, you can call it a city. So Göbekli Tepe stopped just short of being a city. You can see that the alien cortex has not completely taken over the whole scene yet, because the architecture hasn't gone completely geometric. It's still composed of stone circles rather than squares. In the heart of every city, you'll find something you won't find in a village. You'll find the alien cortex's favorite shape for its favorite activity. It's the market square, or quadrata. Here in ancient Ephesus is the agora. It's the market square, the heart of the city. It's the trading space that defines what a city is. Cities, and hence civilization, generally arise from market squares gone wild. Here's the original quadrata in ancient Rome, ground zero for that particular Ponzi scheme. All roads lead to Rome, as they say, and that's because the quadrata becomes the urban tumor at the center of vast consumption emission arteries. Göbekli Tepe was built where it was because it too was the hub at the center of vast trading networks that your prehistorians don't yet know existed. These ancient silk roads over both land and sea predate silk by tens of thousands of years. Your scholars imagine that civilization sprang up independently and mysteriously all over the world, but that's only because they are myopic to the timescales involved and have a blind spot when it comes to extensive ancient seafaring and trading. When you look at how the cancer of civilization spread around the world, you're really looking at the emergence of vast global trading networks in prehistory. Let's rewind back to your early ancestors to explain how this strange phenomena all came about.
Apes have emotional issues, rivalry, violence, and most of all, they're impulsive.
In order to really understand Göbekli Tepe, you need to go back 300,000 years or so to the time when the neocortex foundation came down from the Pleiades and fiddled with your genes to give you a larger brain. But understand, they didn't give you your alien cortex, they just enlarged your brain. That was it. Your alien cortex self-organized, as they expected it might. What happened was that a bigger brain gave you a kind of alter ego, a kind of second brain to second-guess the impulses of your primate and reptilian brains.
Soon this chimp will know it's looking at itself.
That gave you cunning, an alien cortex-based neural regulation and self-control, and that's what separated you from your ape cousins.
Maybe one of the first things that happened during our species evolution is we became much less emotionally reactive. Maybe that's one of the big differences that may explain why we solve problems so differently. We sort of got control of our emotion.
Your alien cortex gives you a unique ability that chimps don't have. It gives you the ability to approach a stranger and trade with them without tearing each other apart. For your primate brain, exchanges like that have always been rather profane and suspect. Your species, Homo sapiens or wise man, should really be called Homo mercator or trading man. because your kind is defined by anything but wisdom. Up until the 15th century, there was an ancient judgment passed on all merchants. Homo mercator vexort nunquam potest Deo plecere, which is Latin for the merchant can conduct himself without sin, but can never be pleasing to your alien cortex. Why merchants were frowned upon in medieval times and before is because trade with strangers was considered vaguely immoral. According to the rules of your primate brain, trade is supposed to be amongst members of a blood-related tribe, which incurs a debt obligation that carries forward and binds the group together. Anonymous trade amongst strangers implies immediate settlement and no further obligation on either side. To your primate and mammalian brains there is the vague whiff of prostitution, if not outright deception about it, and they are absolutely right.
Scientists have taught monkeys the concept of money, and things went downhill from there. One monkey was found to be exchanging money for sex. She gave herself up, got the money, went to the researchers, and bought a grape. Damn, girl, you turning tricks for a grape? One grape? Where's the self-respect? And also, monkeys started robbing each other for money in order to buy food. Monkey's society has been ruined because money has been introduced.
Trading with strangers first started well away from human settlements and on neutral, often sacred ground. Just like with any drug deal, making a successful trade with strangers is problematic. That's why trade and sacred sites have always been closely associated with each other from the beginning. If Jesus ever really tried to drive the merchants and money changers out of the temple, then he was trying to separate avocado from guacamole. In ancient times, temples were often associated with sacred or cult prostitution. The reason for that is that the first trading between your primate ancestors was prostitution. If males from different primate groups encounter one another, it's a recipe for bloodshed. On the other hand, males and females do occasionally fraternize, although at great risk. It's inconceivable that trade could have started with anything other than some ancestor Romeo of yours being gingerly approached by a hungry Juliet while he was butchering a kill. There are a few things to note here. First, the trade has to be done in semi-secret, on neutral or sacred territory well outside the Montague and Capulet villages, often assisted by a holy man or Friar Lawrence fake shaman type. 2. Both trading parties have to be reptilian-brained acquisitive, yet reasonably self-controlled and calculating. 3. Romeo comes off second best and loses or shares the fruit of his hunt, but gets addicted to endorphins from having sex. In time, the site of the romance is ritualized into a regular trading hub, so that the dopamine meat trade can flourish. 4. Juliet comes away with nourishment and the sperm of a self-controlled male that matches her own self-control, and they are liable to pass on that trait to any offspring they have in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. 5. Both Montagues and Capulets hate what's going on between Romeo and Juliet. And for good reason. The play is, after all, a tragedy. In the end, Romeo and Juliet sting themselves to death like scorpions surrounded by a ring of fire of their own making. Trading is never really equitable. Anonymous trading with immediate settlement quickly degenerates into a competitive two-player zero-sum game between buyer and seller. And as Scarface will tell you, success at that game gets you ever more sex in the city.
You gotta make the money first. Then when you get the money, you get the power. Then when you get the power, then you get the woman.
Sex between metrophiles is liable to spawn dozens of little Gordon geckos, with an unholy alliance between their rapidly evolving alien cortex and their reptilian brains.
Greed is right. Greed works.
That particular neural alignment gives them an inordinate love of the marketplace too, so they in turn are drawn to the buzz, the bright lights, and the shiny objects. And so the reinforcing cycle continues. The apple doesn't fall far from places like, well, the Big Apple. And places like that are ultimately the fast breeder chain reactors and proto-urban crucibles, like Göbekli Tepe, that brood up your alien cortex, at the expense of the rest of your rapidly shrinking brain.
How long has there been businesses?
Well, business started from the day one, from early in the world.
And what was they doing business in back in the day?
Many, many, many years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, people were doing business, and they were trading in rocks and stones and other things.
Who would want to buy rocks?
I don't know, man. You gotta ask them that.
Well, testosterone-fueled males would want to buy rocks, assuming, of course, that by rocks you mean stone tools or projectile heads. Projectile heads and the like are really sex tokens for males. They buy dopamine down at the market square for your reptilian brain and alien cortex. But that's where the real problem sets in. In order to feed your endocrine system's addiction, an ever-increasing number of primeval Gordon geckos find that it's far easier to do a derivative trade in hand axes and projectile points than it is to actually hunt and gather. People turn to trading rather than hunting. But paradoxically, that doesn't mean relief for the hunting grounds. On the contrary, the local environment surrounding the market begins to get overexploited, as increasing scarcity and growing demand forces up the price of produce, and those with the most spearheads start to eat increasingly higher on the hog. The flood of stone tools that enter the market as everyone and their dog turn their attention to stone knapping fuel that demand. And as the hunting grounds are stripped, more and more displaced and desperate hunter-gatherers are forced into the melee whether they like it or not, increasing the overall consumption emission footprint of the central marketplace. At that point, you're caught in the civilization trap. This pattern has repeated itself over and over again for tens of thousands of years in human prehistory, long before Göbekli Tepe, where it becomes glaringly obvious to everyone except your paleologists. And it's still happening today. That's why, as your natural environment decays, a corresponding $1.4 quadrillion derivatives market blooms alongside a service-based economy consisting of nothing but BS jobs with no genuine productivity, the modern equivalent of stone knapping for its own sake. The two are closely related, just as they were at Göbekli Tepe. But just how old this phenomena is and just how bad things can get can be seen at the escarpment of Mesak Setefet in southwestern Libya. The stone tool artifacts here are from the Pleistocene era and much, much older than Göbekli Tepe. A recent survey showed that in some parts there were as many as 75 stone tools per square meter. Researchers called it a stone carpet, and conservatively estimated that discarded man-made tools and stone fragments are so thick here that they amount to 1.3 to 2.7 times the volume of the Great Pyramid of Giza every square kilometer. Which, if you think about it, is a great analogy for a Paleolithic pyramid selling or Ponzi scheme. That derivatives market in stone tools could not have been underpinned by more than about 1 gazelle per 100,000 hand axes. Probably a lot worse ratio than perhaps even the modern derivatives market in the financial sector, where every $30 to $40 in derivatives is backed by less than $1 in physical assets. Now you may be wondering if that created the Sahara Desert. The answer is not quite, but it sure helps. Since you archaeologists don't yet understand that stone tools were actually currency, they're perplexed when they see time and again in the archaeological record that hominids apparently forget how to make stone tools, and the quality and craftsmanship decline even as their numbers seem to increase. What's happening is that due to the civilization trap, the stone tool money is becoming debased or devalued in the trading places. As more and more hominids turn to making tools for trade rather than hunting, their value in the marketplace declines, and it's not worth spending as much time and effort on crafting them. You can see Gresham's law in action even in great antiquity, long before the invention of coins or even pottery. Quantity beats out quality. Bad money drives out good. This is a 200,000-year-old Neanderthal hand axe with an inlaid fossil shell. All these are beautifully symmetrical, crafted with infinite care far beyond the utility of tools, and probably irreproducible today. They are objets d'art, far too valuable to use for the hunt. They mark the apogee of value for the currency, the bait at the beginning of the civilization trap. Later you can see their quality decline dramatically as the currency gets debased due to inflation. But there's another more insidious side to the civilization trap. As the overall quality of the party declines, just like Burning Man, it has to get ever bigger, more glitzy and extravagant every year to keep the bandwagon effect going for the increasingly jaded and burnt-out participants. Eventually even Burning Man will outgrow the plier, and then its star will fall too.
Well, I think it's super cool that you went to Burning Man.
Thank you.
It sounds a lot like Coachella.
What did you say?
Oh. It's... What? What? Comparing the burn to a corporate suck-off like Brochella is like comparing Jell-O to ice hockey. One is a Coldplay concert in a field. The other one is a metamorphosis of, it's...
Growth itself is the attractor. No growth prospects, no further investment. So in pursuing civitas, you get unavoidably trapped in a dopamine-fueled hedonic treadmill that's impossible to back away from. Up until now, you've been told a very dangerous lie. The dark secret at the heart of civilization is that it doesn't run on a surplus, it runs on a massive deficit. Do you remember Mike Maloney back in the first episode?
Let me ask you something. If you borrow the very first dollar into existence, and that's the only dollar that exists on the planet, but you promise to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest, where do you get the second dollar to pay the interest? The answer is that you have to borrow that one into existence and promise to pay it back with interest as well. So now there are $2 in existence, but you owe $4, and so on and so on. The result is there's never enough currency to pay the debt.
A few people out there understand that the global financial system is a giant Ponzi fraud. But precious few indeed understand that's just because it's a faithful reflection of the underlying civilization trap that underpins it. Civilization itself is a Ponzi scheme, and the global financial system is just the faithful scorecard that reflects that inescapable truth. So the problem is much deeper than the financial system and the banksters, and can't be solved by currency reform, even with the adoption of cryptocurrencies or even fair currencies like geodo. In order for the civilization extravaganza to sustain itself, it needs to beg, borrow, and steal whatever it can get its hands on just to keep going. Its survival depends on passing its running costs on to future generations, the environment, and its overexploited citizens. These are what economist weasels blithely call externalities and ignore, like penniless alcoholics carelessly tossing the bar tab over their shoulder. So ideas like sustainable cities or a sustainable economy are oxymoronic, only toted by morons that don't understand what a city is. When you hear discussion about sustainable development or environmental protection, you are really just listening to the cancer talking to itself. But curing cancer is easy compared to winding down this monstrous party. Most of you are still in complete denial that the party even has to end. The beer has almost run out, and people are at the point of hitting the paint thinner from out of the tool shed in order to avoid a hangover for a little while longer. But people are still bound to beg that the party carries on somehow. Can't we just tone down the noise a little and moderate our consumption to a sustainable level? There must be some way to keep this party going. There isn't. And the reason for that is that it runs on bread and circuses. Well, bread, liquid bread or beer, and circuses. The first step to overcoming your civilization addiction is to take a closer look at bread and beer, the fundamental gateway drugs it ran on before it started mainlining fossil fuels and flirting with a nuclear overdose. Your so-called life bread probably isn't what you think it is. You ought to have been a lot more skeptical of bread in general, because after all, buried right in the middle of the alien cortex's prayer is the line, "Give us this day our daily bread." That should have aroused your worst suspicions. Baking bread and brewing beer actually predates agriculture, but fattening and unhealthy as they are, did you know that, like civilization, they are uneconomical?
It's not at all clear why anybody would want to make bread, especially for themselves. After you've planted the wheat, harvested it, then threshed it, ground it to flour, kneaded that flour into dough and then baked the bread, you find that you have a negative EROI, or energy return on investment. Bread is the celery of activities. You wind up with less energy than you started with. So it's not at all clear why a hunter-gatherer would do it. Well, one of the obvious answers is for trade. You would make bread if you intended to sell it for a profit. And that's what people were doing.
Since the iconic life bread of civilization can't even actually pay for itself, and was never made to eat but only to trade, that makes even bread and beer a special form of alien cortex entrapment and slavery. Remember that juicy little tidbit when you slavishly repeat your daily prayers in praise of your alien cortex, or when the Pillsbury bait boy suckers your mammalian brain with his carefully alien cortex crafted cuteness.
Sir?
I'll get it together. I promise.
That's just so cute! Where can I sign up for enslavement to uneconomical mass-produced McFood substitutes?
1 in 3 Americans is overweight. An increasing number of those are morbidly obese.
My name is Yael, and I weigh 420 pounds.
I weigh 544 pounds.
I weigh about 460 pounds.
Just like at Göbekli Tepe, today the poor slash and burn the rainforest and the Amazon in order to make burgers for urbanites in America. None of this is sustainable, but currently the zeitgeist of the day is chronic denialism.
You have 24 hours to live.
24 hours?
Well, 22. I'm sorry I kept you waiting so long. Now, a little death anxiety is normal. You can expect to go through 5 stages. The first is denial.
No way, because I'm not dying.
Second is anger.
Why, you little...
After that comes fear.
What's after fear? What's after fear?
Bargaining.
Doc, you gotta get me out of this. I'll make it worth your while.
And finally, acceptance.
Well, we all gotta go sometime.
Mr. Simpson, your progress astounds me.
Your psychological progress, on the other hand, is glacial, and the glaciers are melting while you're still stuck in the shock and denial phase. The strongest form of denialism is that you can somehow sprinkle magic technological pixie dust on all your problems and make them go away.
It's ironic that your elites champion advances in technology to save your civilization. Historically speaking, it's always done the exact opposite. It accelerates the time period for you to reach your consumption emission limit. That limit used to be reached in thousands of years, but thanks to advances in technology, the time period was reduced to just half millennia, and finally to just mere centuries.
One of the best known and studiously ignored paradoxes of environmental economics is the Jevons paradox. All over the world, governments are trying to boost efficiency in order to save resources. But back in 1865, William Jevons noticed that always backfired. Technical progress that yields gains in efficiency simply increases the rate of consumption, rather than reduces it. Even if recycling initiatives were real, and not just fake greenwash placebos to keep up the consumer spirits of the masses, they would also fail due to the Jevons paradox. Right from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, science and technology were only there to remove systemic bottlenecks in the system and increase the velocity of the civilization Ponzi scheme. Systemic bottlenecks are not the same as systemic limits. There is no science to tackle the systemic limits, other than perhaps nuclear science and eugenics. Tear up your invitation to that party. If you plan to power the party with nuclear energy, then this planet really is headed for a poisonous hot mess.
Just like with bread, your whole society has a negative EROI. The reason you're not more aware of that is because people go to a lot of trouble not to do a whole cost accounting.
Civilizations are giant accounting frauds. None of them were ever economically viable. They don't collapse because of overcomplexity or some other nonsense reasons dreamed up by people who don't understand the civilization trap. Like Jarhead Diamond, who is naive enough to think that civilizations somehow get to choose whether they fail or succeed. They all fail because they are all pyramid or Ponzi schemes, and infinite expansion simply doesn't work on a finite planet. And for your species, outer space is barren and empty. So that makes space effectively closed to you. Your alien cortex deceived you into thinking that Earth is an open system, but actually it's a closed system, and so your civilization project is a giant rectilinear fantasy, a childish delusion of linear progress. All along, just like the people at Gobekli Tepe, you've been mal-psychotic. Led on by exploitative fake shamans, you've been trying to create an eternal life perpetual motion machine. An eternal life and perpetual motion machines simply defy physics. Eupsychosis and total surrender to reality is the cure.
As the wheel turns, the coins fall in the slots so that one side of the wheel is always heavier than the other, which would keep pulling that side down and the wheel would never stop turning. Without so much as a push, this wheel would spin forever.
Think about the possibilities. I could build a giant fleet of wind turbines that turn without wind to power the entire Earth. We wouldn't have to burn fossil fuels anymore. This could solve climate change.
The fossil-fueled party is over, the renewable party is fiction, and the nuclear-fueled party is an after-party you wouldn't want to be seen dead at. But why aren't your leaders telling you this? Here, let Mad Max Kaiser and ever-patient Stacey Herbert explain the grim reality to you.
Last month, deep in a 500-page environmental impact statement, the Trump administration made a startling assumption. On its current course, the planet will warm a disastrous 7 degrees by the end of the century. But the administration did not offer this as a dire forecast premised on the idea that the world will fail to cut its greenhouse gas emissions as part of an argument to combat climate change. Just the opposite. This analysis assumes the planet's fate is already sealed and that we should therefore get rid of fuel emission standards and other sort of carbon emissions standards.
Well, let's party on. You know, why try to give up the alcohol if you're an alcoholic? You know, this is obviously a case of denial, 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 especially in that Republican side, the energy side, the funders who's been supporting the climate denial industry out there. Now suddenly they flipped and said, well, you know, we were lying to you. We were enabling this whole thing to happen. Rachel Carson was right. Greenpeace was right. We are facing an extinction event, but it's okay, because we are throwing the biggest end of species party, the extinction party. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. It'll be at Trump Hotel.
It's time to check out of their Hotel California and leave for good. Civilization has to stop here and now. Your species only has 2 realistic choices left: a soft landing and controlled stop, or an uncontrolled, catastrophic and fatal crash. In a way, although it wasn't intended that way, Göbekli Tepe is, after all, a kind of time capsule and warning to you in modern times. But it's not a warning about a comet, it's a warning against you being you.
It's not easy having a good time.
Now you need to reform yourself and your society.
Come fly with me in an upside-down world.
You need to face facts. The plane is upside down, out of gas and on fire. And the pilot is suicidal. It's time for you to storm the cockpit and take control. In the next episode, I'll explain how. But if civilization is on the way out, what's on the way in? Well, you have a potentially bright future ahead of you. Join me, Lord Hugh, in the next episode, and we'll begin to explore it. Your escape from your global Gobekli Tepe promises to be your most exciting adventure yet. The adventure of a lifetime.